Okay, today's lecture is about function, right? Function, and this is part 1. And okay, so let's look at the function. And functions is, if you look at the functions, you can think function as a black box. You can think of a function as a black box with input and outputs. You may have a functions, right, which doesn't have any input or output. This is like unusual, but usually the function has a input and output. So why do we need the functions? Okay, so why we need the functions? If you do not have a functions, then you end up writing all your code as one gigantic routine. I mean, which does not scale at all, you know. So instead of writing one gigantic program, the program can be modularized into many different functions. So basically, this is roughly the function, or your program or the code is equal to. You can think as your program consists of many functions. So basically, running your program is basically the same as executing a sequence of functions. So the example is like this one. So let's say this is your program. This is your main program. Okay, this is your Python program. And without functions, let's say this is a list. Score is a variable, but basically it's a list. And as you can see, this list has your midterm scores 98, 134, and the 53, and like many more. So many more exam scores. And your Python program is supposed to compute the average, highest score, and lowest score, and the standard deviation, right? So one way writing your Python program, actually any other program, is you're going to write your code. There's multiple statement, right? And then this statement is going to compute the average. And then there will be a multiple statement, right, that is going to compute the highest score from this list. And then you're going to write multiple statements, right? And then compute the lowest score. And then there's some statement that can compute the standard deviation. And as you can see, this is going to be one gigantic routine, right? It's a piece of code, and sometimes it's not really easy, right? And let's say you have, three or four, let's say software engineers, right? And then you only have one piece of code, and sometimes it's not easy to assign, let's say, this piece of code to the programmer A, right? And then this code, right? This part of the code will be assigned to programmer B, right? And it's not really easy to do that because you have only one program, and this one piece of code is going to be shared by many programmers. Whereas when you use functions, same thing. But let's say in this case you're going to write a function called average, and this function is going to compute the average of this midterm scores, right? And then you're going to write a function for the highest, a function for the lowest, and a function for compute the standard deviation, right? So in your main program, your main program is going to execute this average functions, right? And this will call and this functions. And the highest is going to make a call to this functions, and etc. So basically executing your piece of code is really same as executing a sequence of these functions, or the sequence of making a sequence of function calls. And this approach, as you can see, is scaled very well and much readable and manageable. So for example, let's say you have programmer A and B, and you have have another programmer C, and then you have another programmer D, right? And then this programmer A is responsible for writing what? These average functions. And programmer B, right? He or she is responsible for writing these functions and etc. So at the end, what you need to do is just execute each functions, right? So definitely this scales very well, as you can see, and much more readable, right? And manageable. So this is like one of the, there are many reasons, but definitely this is one reason that the functions are really useful in basically writing your program in any languages: C, C++, Java, Python, and JavaScript, and etc. Okay, so this is about calling functions, right? And Python, for example, have built-in functions, called, let's say, round or int. So let's say I'll give you an example. So round is a function, right? And then these functions, basically there's two inputs for this function. This is one input argument, and this is it's another argument. So which means your program called a round function, this is a function, round function, asking it to round this first number, right, 6.8275 to the 2 decimal digits. So this is 2 decimal digit, and then round this number, right? So as you can see, if you look at this functions round, it has 2 inputs, right? The function arguments, inputs. So for example, in this case, 6.8275 and 2. So these values are called argument of the function call. And so the function can have many arguments, many inputs, or no argument, no output. So in this case, let's look at the round function. And then this is like a function. So basically the functions, let me just go back, look at this example. So let's look at the round functions. So you know that this is a function, right? And the function has input, right? In this particular function called round has 2 arguments, 2 input arguments, first number and the second number, right? And then the functions only returns this value as an output. So these functions get these 2 input arguments, right, and process these 2 input the processes, right, compute this result, right, based on these 2 input values, and returns the result. This is return value. So basically you can think the function is always has some input, right, input argument. Sometimes you can have, of course you can have a function without no inputs, but let's say the functions input 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then you can have as many inputs, right? And this is input arguments, and then you can have multiple outputs, and this is like function name. Okay, so if you look at the function arguments, functions always has return value, and the output that round the function compute is called return value, and the function returns only one value. But this is not really yes, mostly the functions can return only one value, but you can also make the function can return multiple values. Okay, so this is typically it's only one functions, but you can have you can make the functions which returns multiple outputs. Okay, and then in this case, round, right? This functions returns what, 6.83, right? It's going to return this value, and this value is going to be transferred to this price variable. So you have a price, right? And after you executing this round functions, or your main function call this function round, right? And this is going to return 6.83. So your variable price has the value 6.83. Okay, so that's a function. So let's look at the syntax of function. The syntax of function is, in Python, you have def, definitions. So this is a keyword. Okay, this is a keyword function, a def, definition, and then you have a function name. You have a function name, and then in the function name, after the function name, right, you have what? After function name, you have a list of arguments. A list of actually the input arguments. And then you have in the inside the function you have some statement. Okay, like up to n. So this is what? This is your body of the function. And then note that there is what? There's indentation here. There's indentation, right? And then you have what? At the end you have return. This is a keyword. Right? And then return, either after that you return the result, either variable name, or you can simply return a value. Okay, so this is like, it's a function, right? And this list of input arguments, this is a list of input argument. And then your function name. Right? Inside this function you have statement. Right? This is what your function is supposed to do in the statement, right? And then return, right? It's going to return a output. So this is what return output. So the function body, this function body is executed when the function is called. The function is called by the main. I'll talk about what this main is. So basically this is the syntax of the function. And you can really design your own function, right? So okay, so let me just end my lecture here. So this is a part 1 of your lecture.